yığmıştır. Yüzlerce polis yığmıştır. Büyük bir zorbalıkla karşı karşıyayız ama yılmayacağımı bilmenizi istiyorum.
The mayor of Istanbul, a top political rival of the Turkish president, is on trial for corruption charges. Here's why that's a big deal. Istanbul is the biggest city in Turkey. More than 16 million people live here, and it's the economic powerhouse of the nation. Being mayor of Istanbul is like being the governor of New York State. In 2019, Turkish voters in Istanbul chose 48-year-old civil servant Ekrem İmamoğlu to lead the city. But İmamoğlu is part of the CHP, Turkey's main opposition party. It's fairly secular, and you might describe it as center-left politically. But İmamoğlu's win became this turning point, where the ruling party, the AKP, realized that their support was slipping. Almost immediately, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan tried to overturn the election results, ordered a rerun, but İmamoğlu won again. Ever since, he's been dogged by court cases, from accusations of insulting public officials, which is a crime in Turkey, to an effort to declare his college diploma invalid. In Turkey, if you've been convicted of a crime or you don't have a college degree, you can't run for president, which is what İmamoğlu's supporters want him to do. The next presidential election in Turkey isn't expected until 2028, but recent polling suggests that if İmamoğlu and Erdoğan went head-to-head today, İmamoğlu would win. So fast forward to March 19th, 2025. Early in the morning, Turkish police surround the home of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu and take him into custody. He records this video in his walk-in closet before going to meet police.
Üzülerek söylüyorum, milletimizin iradesini gasp etmeye çalışan bir avuç akıl, benim sevgili polislerimi
Turkish prosecutors accuse İmamoğlu of leading a massive conspiracy, accepting bribes, corruption, and money laundering. They claim he provided assistance to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK, which is classified as a terror group. Now, İmamoğlu has denied all of these charges in court, but hundreds of his colleagues and civil servants have also been taken into custody in several waves of arrests. They're accused of being part of this alleged conspiracy. Many are being held in a high-security mega-prison on the outskirts of Istanbul that's famous for housing detained journalists and political figures. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the case set off massive protests, the biggest Turkey has seen in more than a decade. I've covered Turkey for 6 years now, and increasingly, if a protest does not align with the government's position, it's not tolerated. Istanbul used to have huge pride marches every year. Those are gone. Women's Day marches on March 8th, banned. So very quickly, these protests against İmamoğlu's arrest were deemed illegal. That meant that even being present at a protest was against the law. People still turned out anyway, with signs shouting pro-democracy slogans, and they did this repeatedly, all over the country. There were boycotts, university groups organized marches to City Hall. I think I was most struck by the diversity of people who are at these protests. It's not just young people with relatively nothing to lose. It's retirees, construction workers, housewives. And as the arrests continued, the protests just ramped up, almost in response to the crackdown. Here's what one protester told me: we had to keep him anonymous for his safety.
Türkiye şu anda biz anayasanın bize tanımış olduğu gösteri ve sokağa çıkma hakkımızı kullanıyoruz. Yani barışçıl bir şekilde tavrımızı, kızgınlığımızı, taleplerimizi iletiyoruz. Bu aslında anayasa olarak suç değil. İçeriye alınmalar konusunda söyleyebileceğim tek bir şey var. Yani keyfi uygulanmaların bu topluma gerginlikten başka bir şey vermediğini, bunların insanları sindirmediğini bilmeleri gerekiyor.
Now, for most of the evening, riot police would be lined up against this historic aqueduct on one side of the park, across from City Hall. Every night was different, but generally at some point, some protesters would try and push the police line, triggering a crackdown where police would move in with tear gas and rubber bullets. Now, there were arrests at the protests themselves. Protesters were also kicked and beaten, in addition to being tear gassed. But it quickly became clear that people were also being identified through security camera footage and getting arrested afterwards from their homes. For context here, Istanbul is one of the most surveilled cities in the world. There are surveillance cameras in public places, on mass transit, liquor stores, and we know that Turkish law enforcement used facial recognition technology to identify some of the people who were present at protests, to pursue them in court. And police would actually go to protesters' homes in these dawn raids and put them in handcuffs in front of family and neighbors. Some of these protesters were as young as 18, 19, and they reported being strip searched and denied medical care for injuries when they got to prison. More than 1,000 people were arrested in those early days. This atmosphere also made it really complicated for journalists. People like Bouscaren, a Turkish photographer for the French wire service Agence France Presse, were taken into custody and accused of participating in the protests that they covered. While İmamoğlu is still in pretrial detention for the main corruption trial, a court sentenced him to a year and 8 months in prison for insulting and threatening a public official. That threat, according to the court, happened when İmamoğlu publicly claimed that Istanbul's chief public prosecutor had a, quote, rotten mind. This and an earlier conviction are still under appeal. And while these protests have continued, at least sporadically, they're smaller now. For example, here's a clip from July 1st, as supporters gathered outside City Hall to mark İmamoğlu's 100th day in prison. Meanwhile, the Turkish government is expanding its investigation on the alleged corruption scheme, and they're continuing to arrest people accused of ties to the mayor. One review by Reuters found that 500 people have been detained in the past 9 months, many of them city employees. 220 have been jailed pending trial, and 14 people in prison are mayors from İmamoğlu's opposition party, the CHP. Often, when elected officials are jailed in Turkey, they're replaced by trustees who are chosen by the ruling party. So many people, like this protester, see it as a power grab.
When they want to accuse somebody, they can turn normal politics into terrorism charges. It's very strategic. They just use law as a tool to go after who they want to go after.
The Turkish government rejects claims that these arrests are anything other than real criminal investigations. From their perspective, they're keeping Turkey safe. The reason I think this is important for an American audience to hear is that there are a lot of parallels between Erdogan's consolidation of power and democratic backsliding in other countries. I think Turkey teaches us a lot about what to expect. Erdogan's financial policies reject a lot of democratic norms, like putting pressure on the central bank to keep interest rates down. This has fueled a depreciation of the Turkish lira and an economic crisis that continues today. After a coup attempt in 2016, which Erdogan narrowly survived, his administration has seen dissent as an existential threat. Thousands of judges and civil servants suspecting of being disloyal to the ruling party were sacked, and many branches of government are now consolidated under a new presidential system that was voted in by referendum in 2018. You also see the consequences of a fractured press. Editorially independent newspapers and TV stations have closed due to financial or legal pressures. And the ones that remain are often quite supportive of the government, or they're so beaten down by lawsuits and court fines that they're limited in their ability to cover this. After all, even publishing what a court considers misinformation here is punishable with jail time. Being a journalist in Turkey takes so much out of you that a lot of really talented people leave the profession entirely. But in these protests, a lot of people still see hope. One expert I reached out to was Şebnem Gümüşçü. She's an expert on authoritarianism at Middlebury College, but she was in Istanbul on book leave when it all went down.
So the Turkish people has been subject to all of these authoritarian tools and tactics for about more than a decade now. But they still are resilient, they're still showing up, they're still fighting for their rights, and they understand what's at stake.
These protests aren't just about one mayor anymore. They're about whether Turkish voters have the right to ensure that the person they elect will be allowed to represent them.